It's a scenario that sends a chill down any parent's spine. A routine custody visit, just a weekend with dad. But what happens when that normal routine shatters? When the kid's excitement turns into an unimaginable horror, far from anyone who could help, in a place where society's rules seem to just fade away into the wilderness. For three young sisters, this nightmare became a tragic, unthinkable reality. Their story isn't just about a terrible loss. It's a chilling look into a father's dark mind and the cracks in our systems that can quite literally swallow children whole. Every single week, countless kids move between separated parents. For most, it's just part of life, a familiar rhythm. They pack their little bags, maybe with a favorite toy, excited for adventures and time with their other parent. They're the picture of innocence, their laughter the soundtrack of what should be a hopeful future. But under all that routine, there's a vulnerability, a trust that can be broken in the worst way possible. This is the story of one of those weekends, a weekend that started with three young sisters, giddy with excitement, and ended in a desolate, off-grid spot, their lives gone. It left behind a storm of grief and a community crying out for answers. What really happened out there? And how did the systems meant to protect them fail so badly? Picture three little girls. Let's imagine them as bright spirits, full of life. Maybe a 9-year-old, always looking out for her younger sisters, an 8-year-old, bursting with curiosity, and the youngest, a 5-year-old, probably a bundle of affection with a contagious giggle. For them, a weekend with their father was just a normal thing, a date on the calendar. These visits, part of a custody arrangement, were supposed to be about connection, about making memories. The father, a man who'd served his country, knew the wilderness inside and out, skills that could make a camping trip an amazing adventure. Sure, there might have been unspoken tensions, the kind of complicated feelings that often simmer in separated families, but on the surface, this was just another weekend visit. Now, court records in cases like this sometimes hint at past worries. Maybe there were notes about the father's mental health, or observations about instability that led to rules about his time with the kids, like no overnight stays without someone else there, or limits on where he could take them. Yet, in the days leading up to this particular visit, official reports might say there were no immediate red flags, nothing obvious to signal the horror to come. The mother, like any worried parent in that spot, might have told authorities about her anxieties concerning her ex-partner's mental state, hoping to give her children an extra layer of protection. But the child protection system often needs a very clear, very present danger to change established routines. And so the girls left, probably with waves goodbye and promises to share stories when they got back. They were heading into a weekend that should have been filled with simple childhood joys, looked after by their dad. The destination, a remote, off-grid area, a place far from the familiar, where the wild has its own stark rules. For the kids, it might have sounded like fun. For their father, it became the stage for an unthinkable betrayal. Going from a suburban home to an off-grid camp is like stepping into another world. All the usual comforts, electricity, running water, neighbors close by, they all disappear, replaced by the raw need to fend for yourself, and by isolation. For kids, this can be a new, exciting thing. But for someone with darker plans, this isolation offers a terrifying cloak of secrecy. The exact details of what happened that weekend in the wilderness are still murky, mostly pieced together from the grim discoveries later on. The father, with all his survival skills, knew how to get around in these remote places, how to exist where others couldn't. This know-how, once maybe a source of pride or just a hobby, now looked incredibly sinister. As the hours and then days of the visit ticked by, you can imagine the mother's unease growing. Check-in calls missed. Texts going unanswered. It's that gnawing anxiety every parent knows when they're separated from their kids, especially if there are already underlying worries. The time they were supposed to be back would have come and gone, every minute making the dread worse. The phrase off-grid nightmare barely touches on the terror that must have taken place. We can only try to picture the children's confusion turning into outright fear, their initial excitement souring as they realized something was terribly, terribly wrong. The wilderness, which might have first seemed like a giant playground, would have turned into a menacing place, its silence making their isolation even louder, its vastness reflecting their father's growing emotional distance. The choices the father made in those last hours point to a chilling level of planning. Picking a remote campsite, far from anyone who might see or help, was no accident. It was a calculated move to make sure his actions wouldn't be found out for as long as possible, to make sure he had total control over his daughter's lives. The very skills that made him seem like a capable outdoorsman were twisted into tools for something horrific. What should have been a peaceful spot in nature became the scene of an unspeakable crime, hidden from the world by trees and the sheer indifference of the wild. The moment a routine custody visit officially turns into a missing persons case is a heavy one. When the father didn't bring his daughters back as planned, their mother's alarm bells would have turned into frantic calls to the police. This is where a parent's worst fear crashes into official procedures. By Monday, the awful truth started to come out. The discovery of the children's bodies, in a lonely spot near a remote campground, sent shockwaves through the community and even stunned seasoned investigators. The scene itself, in cases like this, often tells a horrifying story of the victim's final moments, perhaps signs they were tied up or evidence of materials used to silence them. These are the kinds of details that burn into the minds of first responders, details that scream of a calculated, cold-blooded act. Right after a discovery like this, it's chaos. Police agencies rush in, a perimeter is set up, and the slow, careful work of collecting evidence begins. The father's vehicle, maybe found abandoned nearby, becomes a key piece of the early investigation, a silent clue to his presence and his getaway. When the person they're looking for is a parent with wilderness survival skills, the manhunt gets especially tricky. The perpetrator isn't just on the run. They're like a ghost in the landscape, able to hide in terrain that's tough even for the searchers. He'd be considered armed and dangerous, his knowledge of off-grid living flipping from a lifestyle choice to a real advantage against the people trying to find him. Rewards are often put up, along with desperate pleas for any information, anything at all, that could lead to catching him. But while the physical search rages on, another urgent search begins, the hunt for answers. How could this happen? Were there warning signs that everyone missed? And the biggest question of all, did the systems that were supposed to protect these children break down? Trying to understand why a parent would do the absolute worst thing to their own children means looking into some very dark corners of human behavior. In cases like this, the father's background often shows a complicated mix of pressures and sometimes serious psychological problems. A history as a military veteran, for example, might mean experiences with trauma or the development of certain mental health struggles. Of course, the vast majority of veterans lead honorable lives, but for some, switching back to civilian life, especially if they're also dealing with mental health issues, either new or existing, can be incredibly hard. Reports often come out about some mental health issues and some instability, as we've seen in other tragic situations. These issues, even if family knew about them, or they were mentioned in custody court records, might not have seemed bad enough to set off major alarm bells or lead to stricter safety measures before it was too late. The fallout from a messy separation or divorce often plays a huge part. Custody battles themselves can be unbelievably stressful and can make underlying mental health problems much worse. For some people, losing control over their family or feeling like they're losing their children can be too much to bear psychologically. In the most extreme and thankfully rare cases, a parent might develop a twisted need for control or revenge, deciding that if they can't have their children, nobody will. It's a horrifying form of coercive control, where the children become the ultimate pawns in a very disturbed person's emotional endgame. The off-grid part can also tell us something. While many people choose off-grid living because they want to be self-sufficient or closer to nature, for others, it can be a way of withdrawing from society, rejecting its rules, and sometimes it's linked to a paranoid way of seeing the world. This isolation can create a space where twisted thinking isn't challenged, where someone's darkest thoughts can grow without the help of a supportive community or easy access to mental health care. The ability to not just survive but to vanish into the wilderness shows a level of preparedness and a mindset that, in this situation, is deeply disturbing. Investigators would dig into any history of domestic violence, controlling behavior, substance abuse, or previous threats, whether they were said out loud or just hinted at. Friends, family, and old colleagues would be interviewed, all trying to build a psychological picture of the man, looking for the point where a father who could love and care turned into a killer. Often, what they find is a gradual build-up, warning signs that look glaringly obvious in hindsight, but at the time were maybe brushed off, misunderstood, or not dealt with urgently enough. The chilling motive, in the end, might be a terrible combination of untreated mental illness, a severe personality disorder, extreme stress from the family breaking down, and a monstrously selfish final act of control. When children are murdered during a custody visit, it inevitably forces us to look hard at the systems that are supposed to protect them. The same question always comes up afterwards. How did our system let these children down? Often, the answer lies in a series of gaps, bad judgments, or outdated rules, especially when it comes to Amber Alerts and how police and child protective services respond. One of the first and most argued about issues in these cases is the Amber Alert system. When kids are reported missing by a parent, especially if it's a custody dispute and the other parent is the one suspected of taking them, there's a critical decision to make. Does this situation actually meet the strict rules for an Amber Alert? These rules often demand proof of an abduction and a real belief that the child is in immediate danger of serious harm or death. The problem, as so many tragic cases and later reviews have shown, is that when a parent takes a child, it's sometimes not treated with the same urgency as a stranger abduction. There can be this idea, sometimes tragically wrong, that a child with a parent, even if that parent is breaking a custody order, isn't in immediate, life-threatening danger. This can cause delays, or even mean an Amber Alert request is denied. Instead, a less urgent, endangered missing person alert might go out, which doesn't have the same massive, instant public reach as an Amber Alert. This difference isn't small. Those first few hours after an abduction are often the most important. This exact issue has kicked off fierce debates and calls for change in many places. Lawmakers and child advocates argue that Amber Alert rules might be too narrow, not properly considering the very real dangers in family abductions, especially when there are already worries about a parent's mental health or a history of domestic violence. The system, critics say, seems built for the classic stranger kidnapping, which, while terrifying, happens less often than abductions by a family member. Beyond Amber Alerts, the wider response from police and child protective services also gets a hard look. Were earlier warnings from one parent about the other's instability or mental health taken seriously enough? How is risk judged in custody cases where one parent is showing worrying behavior but hasn't quite done something that's an obvious, legally defined threat? Family courts often wrestle with these judgments, trying to balance a parent's rights with a child's safety, sometimes without the right training or enough resources to spot the subtle but growing signs of danger. The off-grid setting of a crime can also show up weaknesses in the system. Organizing search and rescue in remote, rough country is just plain hard. If a parent is known to have survival skills, that should arguably raise the risk level and set off a more specialized, faster response. The tragic end for these three sisters and others in similar, awful situations often becomes the push for change. It forces a painful look at procedures, a questioning of old assumptions, and a drive for new laws to close the gaps that vulnerable children can fall through. The calls for reform usually focus on making Amber Alert rules broader for family abductions, improving training for police and court staff on how to assess risk in custody fights, and making sure agencies share information better when a parent has a known history of mental health problems or violence. When the first shock of such a terrible crime starts to fade, it leaves behind a scarred community and a family broken beyond repair. The legal process, if the person responsible is caught, will be long and painful, a public retelling of unimaginable acts. But even after the courtroom drama, the questions stick around, haunting those left behind and all of us. Could this have been prevented? That's the question that whispers in quiet moments and shouts in public debates. If an Amber Alert had gone out sooner with all its power, could it have changed what happened? This isn't just about rules. It's a deep moral question about how much we value speed and urgency when a child's life is on the line. Many argue that in cases of parental abduction, especially when there are known red flags like mental instability or a history of controlling behavior, the automatic response should be to escalate, to get every single resource moving immediately. The argument that most parental abductions don't end this way is cold comfort when even one does. How many other children might be living with similar risks, their safety hanging on systems that might have huge blind spots? The focus often shifts to the family courts, to the enormous responsibility on judges and social workers to make life-changing decisions based on their judgments of who is a fit parent. Are these professionals trained well enough to spot the subtle signs of growing danger, especially in cases with mental health issues that don't neatly fit into the boxes that demand action? Is there enough support and protection for parents who try to sound the alarm about an ex-partner's dangerous behavior? The community, too, struggles with its own feelings of helplessness and anger. Vigils are held, tributes are made, But under all the shared grief is a demand for someone to be held accountable and for real change. These aren't just random incidents. They're the most extreme examples of failures that can exist within our child protection systems. The calls for reform get louder, more insistent. Lawmakers might promise reviews, special committees, and new laws. But the real test is whether these efforts actually lead to changes that stop the next tragedy. And what about the surviving family? For a mother who trusted her children to their father for a normal visit, only to have that trust met with the ultimate horror, the way forward is unimaginable. The grief is always there, the what-ifs a never-ending torture. Trying to find meaning in such a senseless loss can take a lifetime. These lingering questions weigh heavily. They force us to face uncomfortable truths about the weak spots in our society, about the difficulties of protecting children in broken families, and about our shared duty to do better. These 3 little girls, and others lost in similar nightmares, deserve more than just our sadness. They deserve a promise from us to learn from these tragedies and to build a world where a routine weekend visit never, ever ends like this. The issues brought up by stories like this are complicated and really troubling. If you or someone you know is worried about a child's safety in a custody situation, or if you're dealing with domestic violence or coercive control, please know there's help out there. Reach out to your local child protective services, domestic violence hotlines, or legal aid groups in your area. Being aware and taking action can make a difference. And if this story has affected you, think about supporting organizations that fight for stronger child protection laws and better mental health support for families in crisis. Let's try to turn this grief into a force for real change. Don't forget to subscribe for more explorations of cases that demand our attention and thought. A routine weekend visit, a father, 3 young sisters full of life. These should have been the makings of cherished family memories. Instead, they became the pieces of an off-grid nightmare, a story carved out of sorrow and disbelief. The empty wilderness that became their final resting place is a harsh symbol of the deep isolation that can hide terrible acts, and the devastating results when a parent's inner darkness swallows the light of their own children. This tragedy, while it reflects the unique pain of one family, forces all of us to face bigger, deeply unsettling questions. It makes us examine the very systems designed to shield the vulnerable. The Amber Alert rules that might pause when a parent is the one who took the child. The family courts trying to navigate the difficult path of custody and risk assessment, and the societal supports for people struggling with mental health crises before they explode into violence. The chilling reasons why a father would lure and then murder his own children might always be, in some ways, beyond our understanding, a lack of empathy so profound it's hard to explain. But the call to action that comes from such a loss is crystal clear. It's a demand for us to be vigilant, to push for reform, and to refuse to accept that outcomes like this are just unavoidable. It's a commitment to listening more closely to the whispers of concern before they become screams of anguish, and to making sure that the excitement in a child's eyes as they head off for a visit is never put out by the very person who should have been their strongest protector. The memory of these lost lives must push us to fix the broken parts of the systems meant to keep all children safe, so that no more futures are stolen in an off-grid nightmare or anywhere else.